What force drives a man to lay down his life for the faith, with his arms outstretched in the shape of a cross and a "Long live Christ the King" on his lips? On November 23, 1927, Father Miguel Agustin Pro faced the firing squad with an unheard-of serenity. His martyrdom, documented by the press that the Mexican government had summoned in hopes of capturing the fear of a cowardly Catholic, became an immortal testimony of Christian courage. Through his ingenious disguises, unyielding humor, and zeal for souls amidst religious persecution, Blessed Father Pro shows us how to respond to the divine call with radical generosity. Chapter 1. A Restless and Adventurous Child. Miguel Agustin Pro Juarez was born on January 13, 1891, in Guadalupe, Zacatecas, into a deeply Catholic family. His father, Don Miguel Pro, managed mines, and his mother, Doña Josefa Juarez, was known for her fervent devotion and dedication to the poor. From an early age, little Miguelito showed a bold and adventurous personality. Barely learning to crawl, he ventured onto the windowsill of a 3-story high window while his nanny was distracted, causing his mother to panic when she discovered him about to fall into the void. This first adventure foreshadowed the intrepid spirit that would characterize his entire life. As he grew, Miguel developed a sharp sense of humor and an inclination for clever pranks that he used to bring joy to his family and later to help him endure his own sufferings. His sisters were often the victims of his mischief, but no one could stay angry for long with that contagious smile and kind heart. The Pro home was a refuge of faith. Miguel watched his mother care for the poor miners who worked for his father, learning that the Catholic faith should be manifested in concrete works of mercy. At night, the family gathered to pray the rosary, and in that atmosphere of piety and service, young Miguel formed his Christian conscience, though without yet showing signs of a religious vocation. His formal education took place in the quiet surroundings of the Mexican countryside, where Miguel was noted more for his charisma and witty remarks than for his academic achievements. He was an average student, but possessed a special intuition for human relationships. He knew how to listen, comfort, and make people laugh, qualities that would later be invaluable in his priestly apostolate. As a child and adolescent, Miguel experienced firsthand the social inequalities of pre-revolutionary Mexico. He saw the poverty of the miners and the stark contrast between his comfortable life and that of those who served his family. These early experiences awakened in him a social sensitivity that, later illuminated by faith, would transform into an apostolic zeal to bring the comfort of Christ to all Mexicans, especially the most needy. Chapter 2. The Awakening of the Vocation. During his adolescence, Miguel went through a period of drifting away from the faith that greatly worried his parents. Not a total abandonment, but a phase of lukewarmness and distraction with worldly matters. His sociable personality and natural charm led him to be interested in youthful diversions and worldly friendships. On one occasion, he even became interested in a non-Catholic young woman, writing her a letter that, due to a providential mistake, ended up in his mother's hands, who intervened to cut off that potentially problematic relationship for her son's faith. This period of drifting away so troubled his parents that they resorted to a stratagem to bring him back to the church. One day, his mother asked him to deliver a veil to a priest as a special favor. That seemingly casual encounter was actually a plan for young Miguel to speak with the priest, who managed to touch the right chords in his heart and rekindle his interest in the ways of God. The real transformation began when some Jesuit missionaries visited the local parish. Miguel, who had begun to recover his religious fervor, was impressed by the powerful preaching and the testimony of those priests. Something in the Ignatian charisma, in that blend of intelligence, deep spirituality, and apostolic commitment, resonated in the depths of his being. It was as if suddenly all the scattered pieces of his life, his social sensitivity, his extroverted nature, his desire to serve, found a perfect place to fit in. Without immediately informing his parents, Miguel began seriously discerning his religious vocation. Wanting to be absolutely sure before taking the step, he engaged in long conversations with the Jesuits and dedicated more time to personal prayer. In the silence of the church, before the Blessed Sacrament, he heard with increasing clarity the voice of the Lord inviting him to join the Society of Jesus. Finally, when he was certain of his vocation, he communicated his decision to his parents. Far from opposing it, they received the news with joy, recognizing that God had chosen their son for the service of the altar. In 1911, at the age of 20, Miguel entered the Jesuit novitiate, thus beginning a path of formation that would, through many trials and pilgrimages, lead him to the altar of martyrdom 16 years later. Chapter 3. Pilgrim for the Faith. Just 2 years after Miguel entered the novitiate, the Mexican Revolution took an anti-clerical turn that forced the Jesuits to leave the country. The young novice had to flee disguised as a peasant, thus beginning a long pilgrimage that would take him through the United States, Spain, Nicaragua, Belgium, and other countries. This experience of exile would deeply mark his formation and his vision of the Church as a universal community that transcends national borders. During these years of formation, Miguel had to face not only the pain of exile, but also serious health problems. He developed a stomach ulcer that caused him intense pain, which he bore with admirable patience and even humor. His fellow students would later recall how he used his jokes and witty remarks to distract others when he suffered from pain attacks, cleverly covering his discomfort by placing his hand on his stomach. Despite his health difficulties and not standing out particularly in theological and philosophical studies, Miguel shone through his extraordinary charity and apostolic commitment. His superiors recognized in him a genuinely Ignatian spirit, pragmatic, adaptable to circumstances, passionate about leading souls to Christ. His extroverted personality and ease of connecting with people from all walks of life made him an ideal instrument for the apostolate in troubled times. While studying in Europe, news from Mexico grew increasingly alarming. Religious persecution intensified. Many priests were martyred and churches were desecrated. To add to his personal cross, he received the news of his mother's death, whom he could not accompany in her final moments. Miguel offered all these sufferings for the persecuted church of his homeland, turning pain into a source of spiritual wealth, according to the Catholic tradition that sees union with the cross of Christ as a fountain of redemption. Finally, on August 31st, 1925, Miguel Pro was ordained a priest in Belgium. His health was so deteriorated that his superiors, convinced he had little time left, decided to send him back to Mexico so that at least he could die in his homeland. Before returning, the new priest made a pilgrimage to the sanctuary of Our Lady of Lourdes, where he consecrated his priestly ministry to the Virgin Mary and completely dedicated himself to her, willing to share not the joys of Bethlehem or the glories of the resurrection, but the sorrows of Calvary. Chapter 4. The Apostle of 1,000 Disguises. When Father Pro returned to Mexico in 1926, he found a country immersed in severe religious persecution. President Plutarco Elias Calles had promulgated anti-Catholic laws that prohibited all public worship, closed churches and convents, and persecuted priests and religious. Barely setting foot on Mexican soil, an even more restrictive law was enacted. Far from being discouraged, the young Jesuit saw in these circumstances an apostolic challenge that he would face with ingenuity and courage. Unable to wear the priestly habit or publicly exercise his ministry, Father Pro became the man of 1,000 disguises. One day he appeared as a mechanic among the city's taxi drivers, preaching the gospel while pretending to repair their vehicles. The next, he presented himself as an elegant young man with a mustache, an ornament especially useful as a disguise since priests were forbidden to have one, winning the trust of people from all social classes. On another occasion, Pursued by government agents, he embraced a young woman on the street, whispering in her ear, "I am a priest. Help me pretend we are dating," thus managing to escape his pursuers. He established a network of Eucharistic stations, private homes, where he celebrated Mass and distributed communion to the faithful. Each day he administered between 300 and 400 communions, reaching up to 2,300 on Sundays and special days. This also meant an intense work in the sacrament of reconciliation, since at that time the faithful would confess before receiving communion. Riding his bicycle, with the Blessed Sacrament hidden in a backpack, he roamed the city, bringing spiritual comfort to a people starving for the sacraments. Witnesses recall Father Pro's deep Eucharistic devotion. When he celebrated Mass, even under the most precarious circumstances, he was transfigured. His face reflected absolute concentration on the mystery of the altar, and those attending these clandestine liturgies felt that, through him, Christ himself was tangibly present. This intimate union with Christ in the Eucharist was the source of his courage and creative apostolic spirit. During his brief ministry in Mexico, just over a year, the Father Pro regularized innumerable marriages, baptized people who had received communion without being baptized, heard the confessions of sinners estranged from the sacraments for years, catechized both children and adults, and brought viaticum to the dying, all under constant risk of being discovered and arrested. His letters to his Jesuit superiors overflow with apostolic joy over these conquests for Christ, revealing his genuine concern for the salvation of souls rather than any political or social agenda. Before continuing, we would like to know, did you know the story of Father Pro? Were you aware of his ingenious disguises to bring the sacraments to the faithful during the persecution? Write in the comments and tell us from where you are watching. Chapter 5. Humor as a Spiritual Weapon. One of the most characteristic traits of Father Miguel Pro, and perhaps the least known, was his extraordinary sense of humor that he maintained even in the most adverse circumstances. As a child, he was known for his jokes and witty antics that delighted his family, although they sometimes embarrassed his sisters. This natural joviality, far from disappearing during his years of religious formation, transformed into an apostolic instrument and a spiritual resource to face suffering. During his Jesuit formation years, when his stomach ulcer caused him intense pain, Miguel used his humor as a shield. He told jokes and funny anecdotes, taking advantage of his companions' laughter to discreetly ease his stomach pain. No one suspected that this cheerful and playful young man endured constant physical pain. He had learned to transform suffering into an occasion for others' joy, anticipating Paul's maxim to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. In his clandestine ministry in Mexico, humor was also an invaluable tool. His disguises, often ingenious and even comical, revealed a boundless creativity in the service of the gospel. The faithful recalled how, in the midst of the most tense circumstances, celebrating Mass in private homes under the risk of being discovered or narrowly escaping government agents, Father Pro maintained his serenity and even made jokes that eased the tension and strengthened the spirit of those with him. This uncontainable joy was not superficial or a lack of understanding of the gravity of the situation. On the contrary, it arose from a deep Ignatian spirituality that allowed him to find God in all things and maintain inner peace amid the external storm. Father Pro had understood that Christian joy does not depend on external circumstances, but on an intimate union with Christ, and that humor can be an expression of filial trust in divine providence. Even in the face of death, he maintained this youthful serenity. According to witnesses, while awaiting the moment of his execution, he joked with the guards and displayed such calm that they were deeply impressed. One soldier later commented, "I had never seen a man face death with such peace." Father Pro thus demonstrated that Christian joy reaches its highest expression when, as the Gospel teaches, we are able to rejoice and be glad even in persecution, knowing that great will be our reward in heaven. Chapter 6. Eucharistic and Marian Devotion. If anything characterized Father Miguel Pro's spirituality, it was his deep Eucharistic devotion. Witnesses of his life recall how he transformed during the celebration of Mass. Despite the precarious circumstances in which he had to celebrate, in private homes, with few liturgical elements, always under the threat of being discovered, Father Pro lived each Eucharist with an intensity that moved those present. His face reflected absolute concentration on the mystery of the altar, and those participating in these clandestine liturgies felt that, through him, Christ himself became palpably present. This Eucharistic devotion also manifested in his zeal to bring communion to the faithful. Riding his bicycle, with the Blessed Sacrament hidden in a backpack, he roamed the streets of Mexico City, distributing up to 1,300 communions in a single day. In an era when the faithful did not receive communion as frequently as today, and always after confessing, this number reveals not only the intensity of his apostolic work, but also the spiritual hunger of a people deprived of the sacraments due to persecution. Alongside his love for Eucharistic Christ, Father Pro cultivated a tender devotion to the Virgin Mary, especially under the title of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Patroness of Mexico. Before returning to his homeland, he made a pilgrimage to the Sanctuary of Lourdes, where he consecrated his priestly ministry to the Virgin Mary. In a moving prayer, he expressed his desire not to partake in the joyful mysteries of Bethlehem or the glorious ones of the resurrection, but in the sorrowful ones of Calvary, thus associating himself with the redemptive sacrifice of Christ under Mary's maternal gaze. The union of these two devotions, Christ the King present in the Eucharist and the Virgin of Guadalupe, constituted the axis of his spirituality and the secret of his apostolic strength. It is no coincidence that he died with a crucifix in one hand and the rosary in the other, symbols of this double devotion that animated his entire life. His final cry, "Long live Christ the King," summed up a life consecrated to proclaiming the sovereignty of Christ over Mexico and over every human heart. For Father Pro, as for the entire Catholic tradition, genuine devotion was not a matter of sentimentality, but of concrete, everyday commitment. His love for Christ in the Eucharist was expressed in hours of silent adoration and in his zeal to bring communion to the sick and the dying. His Marian devotion manifested in the daily recitation of the Rosary and in the filial trust with which he placed all his apostolic endeavors under the protection of the little brown one of Tepeyac. This spirituality, rooted in the finest tradition of the Church, gave him the strength to face martyrdom with serenity. Chapter 7. The Ultimate Offering. On September 21, 1927, while celebrating Mass in a private home, Father Pro experienced something extraordinary. He had often preached that priests must be willing to offer their lives for the salvation of Mexico. That day, in the intimacy of the Eucharistic sacrifice, he felt clearly that he must offer himself as a victim for his homeland. At the end of the celebration, he confided to a nun, "It may be my imagination, but during this Mass, I had the impression that God has accepted my sacrifice." Just 2 months later, his premonition would be dramatically confirmed. The superiors of the Society of Jesus, aware of the danger Father Pro faced due to his intense apostolic activity, tried to limit his movements. In moving letters addressed to his provincial, the priest pleaded to be allowed to continue his ministry. "I feel like a caged jaguar when I think of how many souls die without the sacraments." This apostolic anguish reveals the heart of a true shepherd who, following the example of the Good Shepherd, was willing to give his life for his sheep. In October 1927, Father Pro joyfully participated in the Feast of Christ the King, recently instituted by Pope Pius II. Despite the government's prohibition, thousands of the faithful came to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe to proclaim the kingship of Christ over Mexico. This celebration, which united Father Pro's two great devotions, Christ the King and the Virgin of Guadalupe, was like a spiritual prelude to his martyrdom that would occur a month later. The political situation in Mexico became even more complicated when a group of Catholics, without the knowledge or approval of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, attempted an attack against the elected president Álvaro Obregón. Although neither Father Pro nor his brothers Humberto and Roberto had any relation to this incident, they were arrested and falsely accused of participating in the conspiracy. The government, without conducting a fair trial, decided to summarily execute them as a warning to Catholics. President Calles, wanting to publicly humiliate the church, ordered the press to be gathered to document the execution, expecting to capture images of cowardly Catholics trembling before the firing squad. However, Providence turned this propagandistic maneuver into an imperishable testimony of Christian strength in the face of martyrdom, which soon spread throughout the world. Chapter 8. Long Live Christ the King. On the morning of November 23, 1927, Father Miguel Pro was taken to the courtyard of the General Police Inspection to be executed. Dressed in civilian clothes and a tie, he walked with a firm step and a serene face. The photographers and journalists summoned by the government expected to capture the fear of a cowardly priest, but instead they witnessed something very different. The testimony of a martyr willing to die for his faith with superhuman dignity. When Major Luis Torres asked if he had any last wish, Father Pro replied, "Yes, I want to pray." He then knelt in the prison courtyard, took out his crucifix and his rosary, kissed the crucifix, and remained silent for a few minutes, absorbed in prayer. Those who watched could see on his face not the fear they expected, but a peace that could only come from above, the serenity of one who knows he is going to meet someone who awaits him with love. After finishing his prayer, he stood up with the rosary in one hand and the crucifix in the other. The soldiers wanted to blindfold him according to the execution protocol, but he kindly refused. "It is not necessary." In a clear voice, he forgave those who were about to execute him, spread his arms in the shape of a cross, as Christ on the cross, and with his eyes open and his face serene, pronounced his final words, "Long live Christ the King." Immediately, the firing squad shot him. Since he did not die instantly, an officer approached and delivered the coup de grâce. The photographs of that moment, far from serving the anti-Catholic propaganda as the government intended, became a worldwide testimony of Christian strength in the face of persecution. The image of Father Pro with his arms outstretched in the form of a cross, forgiving his executioners and proclaiming the kingship of Christ, spread throughout the world and strengthened the faith of countless Catholics. President Calles' propagandistic move had turned against him. Alongside Father Pro, his brother Humberto was also executed. Roberto, the third brother, was saved thanks to the last-minute intervention of a foreign ambassador. The bodies of the martyrs were laid out and the next day taken to the cemetery by an impressive crowd. More than 500 cars and thousands of people who, defying the regime, sang religious hymns and cheered for Christ the King. During this funeral procession, the first miracle attributed to Father Pro's intercession occurred. A blind woman who approached to touch his coffin instantly regained her sight. Chapter 9. Shepherd of Souls in Dark Times. Although Father Miguel Pro exercised the priesthood for only a year and a few months, his ministry was of extraordinary apostolic intensity. Despite the severe restrictions imposed by the anti-Catholic government, he managed to develop a pastoral work that reached thousands of the faithful in Mexico City and its surroundings. His letters to his Jesuit superiors, written during this period, clearly reveal the central concern of his priestly heart, the salvation of the souls entrusted to his care. "I am tormented thinking of how many people die without the sacraments," he wrote to the provincial who had ordered him to limit his activities for safety reasons. This anguish for the souls that departed for eternity without the comfort of the last sacraments drove him to constantly risk his life, defying restrictions and tirelessly seeking out the sick and the dying to bring them the viaticum and the anointing of the sick. For Father Pro, as for every priest formed in the Catholic tradition, there was no greater tragedy than a death without reconciliation with God. With equal zeal, he worked to regularize the marriages of people living in irregular situations. In his letters, he joyfully recounted how many couples living together, as they were then called, he had managed to unite according to church law. Likewise, he celebrated as great apostolic victories the baptisms of people who, out of ignorance, had been receiving communion without being baptized. Every sacrament administered was, for him, a triumph of divine grace over the forces of evil that tried to silence the Church. Though sensitive to the material needs of the poor, following the example of his mother, who cared for unprotected minors, Father Pro never subordinated the spiritual dimension of his ministry to merely social concerns. For him, as for the entire Catholic tradition, material charity must always be united and ordered to spiritual charity. His deepest joy was to lead souls to Christ, including the conversion of those estranged from the faith or even hostile to it. In one letter, he mentioned with particular satisfaction having managed to bring a hardened socialist into the Catholic fold. This brief but intense priestly ministry of Father Pro, carried out under the most adverse circumstances, reminds us that the essence of the Catholic priesthood does not change with the times or external circumstances. Today as yesterday, the priest is above all a minister of the sacraments, a shepherd seeking the lost sheep, a doctor of souls who applies the balm of divine mercy, and all this out of love for Christ, the good shepherd who gives his life for his sheep. Chapter 10. The Legacy of a Martyr. The funeral of Father Miguel Pro and his brother Humberto became an unprecedented manifestation of faith in a Mexico under religious persecution. More than 500 cars and thousands of people accompanied the coffins to the cemetery, openly defying the anti-Catholic regime. Instead of intimidating Mexican Catholics as the government had intended, Father Pro's martyrdom inflamed their faith and determination to peacefully resist in defense of religious freedom. As has always happened in the history of the Church, the blood of martyrs becomes the seed of new Christians. Soon, popular devotion began to invoke Father Pro's intercession. The first miracle attributed to him occurred during his funeral procession, when a blind woman who touched his coffin instantly regained her sight. This and other extraordinary signs helped spread his fame for holiness not only in Mexico, but throughout Latin America and beyond. While the name of President Calles, his executioner, faded in the annals of political history, the name of the humble Jesuit grew in the memory of the Universal Church. The photographs of his execution, which the government had ordered taken as anti-Catholic propaganda, paradoxically became a powerful visual testimony of Christian strength in the face of persecution. The image of Father Pro, with his arms outstretched in a cross, before the firing squad transformed into an icon that traveled the world, inspiring generations of Catholics to live their faith with courage amid adversity. That photograph, taken to humiliate the Church, became one of the most striking visual testimonies of the 20th century on the dignity of Christian martyrdom. Father Pro's story aroused special interest among seminarians and young priests around the world, for whom he became a model of apostolic zeal and priestly fidelity. Long before his official beatification, he was already venerated in seminaries and formation houses as an example of radical dedication to Christ and the Church. His ability to creatively adapt the priestly ministry to hostile circumstances offered an inspiring paradigm for times of growing secularization and marginalization of the Christian witness. Chapter 11. The Spiritual Weapons of the Martyr. Where did Father Miguel Pro draw the extraordinary strength that he demonstrated up to the moment of his martyrdom? This question leads us to explore the spiritual weapons that forged his character and sustained his ministry under the most adverse circumstances. Like every saint in the Catholic tradition, Father Pro did not improvise his heroic response to martyrdom, but prepared for it day by day through an intense inner life nourished by concrete spiritual practices. The first and fundamental weapon was his deep life of prayer. Despite his intense apostolic activity, Father Pro never neglected moments of intimacy with the Lord. Following Ignatian spirituality, he practiced the daily exam, which allowed him to recognize both the gifts received from God and his own limitations. Those who lived with him during his brief ministry in Mexico testify that even on the busiest days, he found moments to retire and pray, often before the Blessed Sacrament, hidden in one of the Eucharistic stations he had established in private homes. The second spiritual weapon of Father Pro was his unshakable trust in divine providence. Living in constant danger of being captured, he depended entirely on God's protection for his daily ministry. This trust was neither naive nor reckless. It was accompanied by prudent precautions with his disguises and movements, but it was rooted in the certainty that nothing could happen to him outside of God's will. In one of his letters he wrote, "I live each day as if it were my last, leaving tomorrow in God's hands." This attitude of filial surrender allowed him to maintain serenity amid constant danger. The third weapon was his conscious love for the cross of Christ, expressed in the acceptance of his own physical and moral sufferings. The stomach ulcer that had tormented him since his days of formation, the pain of exile, the concern for his persecuted family, the anguish for the suffering Mexican church, all these afflictions united him to the redemptive sacrifice of Christ, turning them into a source of spiritual richness. As he once wrote, "I have discovered the secret of joy in suffering, which is to offer everything to Jesus for the salvation of souls." The fourth indispensable spiritual weapon was his tender Marian devotion. Father Pro deeply lived the Jesuit motto, "To Jesus through Mary." His consecration to the Virgin at the Sanctuary of Lourdes before returning to Mexico definitively marked his priestly spirituality. In his prayer of surrender, he asked the Mother of God to associate him not with the joyful or glorious mysteries, but with the sorrowful ones, thus participating in Calvary alongside her. The rosary, which he would hold in his hand until the very moment of his execution, was his favored prayer and his shield in times of danger. Chapter 12. Father Pro's Teachings for Our Daily Lives. The life of Blessed Miguel Pro, although lived under extraordinary circumstances of religious persecution, offers profound and applicable lessons for Catholics living in today's world. His testimony is not just to be admired from afar, but a practical source of inspiration for our daily lives, in which we also face, albeit in different ways, challenges to our faith and Catholic identity. The first lesson we can draw from Father Pro is apostolic audacity. In a world where many Catholics timidly live out their faith, relegating it to the private sphere for fear of what others may say or being labeled as fanatics, Father Pro's example invites us to a serene yet unyielding courage to proclaim our faith. It is not a matter of aggressive or loud attitudes, but the firm decision not to hide who we are and what we believe. This audacity can be manifested in small, everyday gestures, making the sign of the cross before eating in a restaurant, naturally speaking about our faith in conversations with non-believers, or respectfully but clearly defending the Church's teachings when they are misinterpreted or attacked in our work or social environments. The second lesson is evangelistic creativity. Father Pro adapted his ministry to adverse conditions, using disguises and ingenious methods to bring the sacraments to the faithful. Today, although in most countries we do not face legal prohibitions, we do encounter cultural walls that hinder the transmission of the gospel. Relativism, consumerism, religious indifference, information and entertainment overload. Inspired by Father Pro, we are called to find creative ways to disguise ourselves, that is, to adapt the evangelical message without distorting it, so that it can be heard and understood by today's man and woman. This may mean using digital media, art, literature, or simply a renewed language that speaks to the heart of the contemporary human without renouncing the full truth of the gospel. The third lesson, perhaps the most necessary in our time, is Christian joy amid difficulties. Father Pro's humor, his ability to smile even in the face of death, reveals a profound understanding of the Christian joy that does not depend on external circumstances. In a society marked by anxiety, depression, and the desperate search for momentary pleasures, Catholics are called to witness a deeper joy, rooted in the certainty of God's love and the hope of eternal life. This joy does not mean denying suffering or adopting superficial optimism, but living everything with the confidence of one who knows that, to those who love God, all things work for good. Everyday trials, a health problem, economic difficulties, family conflicts, can become an opportunity to practice that supernatural joy which characterized Father Pro. The fourth practical application is the priority of the inner life. Despite his frenetic activity in a context of persecution, Father Pro maintained an intense life of prayer that was the source of his apostolic strength. For us, immersed in the vertiginous pace of modern life and bombarded by constant stimuli, this lesson is crucial. We need to create Eucharistic stations in our lives, spaces and times of silence and reflection amid the digital noise and hyperactivity. This might mean waking up a little earlier to dedicate time to prayer, using public transportation time to pray the rosary, seeking moments of Eucharistic adoration between our activities, or transforming some of our daily tasks into occasions for prayer through the practice of the presence of God. Finally, Father Pro teaches us the value of suffering when united with Christ. His chronic illness and the persecutions he suffered did not embitter him. Rather, they became a source of apostolic fecundity. In a world that avoids pain at all costs and views suffering as the greatest evil, Catholics are called to show another way, not to seek suffering for its own sake, which would be masochism, but to accept and integrate it into our spiritual life when it comes to meet us. Illnesses, disappointments, and the limitations inherent in the human condition can become, when offered with love as Father Pro did, powerful instruments for personal sanctification and redemption for others. The legacy of Blessed Miguel Pro is not a treasure of the past to be admired in history books, but a light that illuminates our path as Catholics in the 21st century. His example reminds us that holiness is not the prerogative of past ages, nor the result of extraordinary circumstances, but a real possibility for every baptized person who decides to live their faith radically in the concrete circumstances of daily life. May his intercession help us also to bear witness to Christ the King in our own time and place with the same courage, creativity, joy and love with which this young Mexican Jesuit did nearly a century ago. Chapter 13. Prayer to Blessed Father Miguel Pro. O glorious Blessed Miguel Agustin Pro, priest of Christ and valiant martyr, who in times of dark persecution carried the light of the gospel to the most dangerous corners, we humbly beseech you to intercede for us before the throne of divine mercy. You who knew how to live with joy in the midst of pain, teach us to transform our sufferings into a source of sanctification and apostolate. May we, like you, know how to offer our daily trials for the salvation of souls and the triumph of the Holy Church in our time. Help us to understand that the cross, embraced with love, is not a heavy burden, but a gentle yoke that unites us to the redemptive sacrifice of Christ. You who exercised your priestly ministry with ingenious creativity, even in the most adverse circumstances, obtain for today's priests the same apostolic zeal for the salvation of souls. May no difficulty stop them in their mission of bringing the sacraments to every corner of our society, especially to those most distant and in need of divine mercy. You who loved Christ tenderly in the Eucharist, to the point of risking your life, to bring him to the faithful starving for the bread of life, awaken in us a burning love for the Blessed Sacrament. May our frequent communions and hours of adoration transform us, as they did you, into valiant witnesses of the real presence of Christ among us. You who professed a tender devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, Mother of Latin America and Star of Evangelization, teach us to love her with a filial heart and to turn to her in all our needs. May we, like you, be able to say at the end of our life, to Jesus through Mary, with the rosary in our hands and the love of the Mother in our hearts. You who faced martyrdom with your arms outstretched in a cross, and long live Christ the King, on your lips grant us the grace of final perseverance, that in the hour of our death, whatever form God may choose to call us to his presence, we may offer our soul with the same serenity and surrender with which you offered yours. Finally, Blessed Miguel Pro, we ask that you intercede, especially for religious freedom in all the peoples where Christians are persecuted or discriminated against for their faith. May your example inspire our brothers and sisters who suffer for the name of Christ, and may your protection strengthen them in the trial until the dawn of freedom and peace breaks for them. We ask all this trusting in your powerful intercession before the Lord, who crowned you with the glory of martyrdom and has made you a model and protector of his church. Amen. Blessed Miguel Pro, pray for us. Long live Christ the King.